Chapter 3: The Crying Tree. Tim hadn't spoken to anyone in 4 days, not because he was avoiding them, at least not consciously, but because he couldn't think of a single thing to say that didn't feel like a lie. He made coffee, fed mist, stared at the blinking cursor on his laptop. The file was open. The name was typed. But every time he hovered over the notes Sarah had left, his chest tightened. North Carolina, 2009. 3 missing kids. 1 survivor. A tree that cried their names. He leaned back in his chair and let the rain fill the silence. It hadn't stopped since the hitchhiker vanished. Tim clicked through old archived reports, local news clippings, blog posts, bits of Sarah's half-written drafts. There were no photos of the tree, just a mention of a forest north of Grayson. One child named in the article, Ryan Mercer, age 14. The survivor, Tim searched the name. The trail was short, a school memorial, then nothing. Until a comment on a message board from 2 years ago, they didn't believe me, but it still cries at night. RM42. It had 2 replies, one troll, one dead link. He copied the handle, tracked it to an abandoned blog. No updates since 2015, but the About page had an email. He hesitated, then typed, subject, the tree. Ryan, if this is still you, I believe you. I want to talk. I don't want to expose you. I'm just looking for answers, Tim. He hit send, closed the laptop. The room was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. Mist stared at the wall, ears twitching. Tim followed her gaze. The hallway was dark. Still, he checked. Nothing, just a hallway, but he left the light on anyway. The next morning, the reply was waiting. Grayson hasn't changed, but the woods have. If you're coming, come alone. No signature, no hello, just coordinates. Tim didn't tell Ronald, didn't tell anyone. He packed a duffel, charged his camera and voice recorder, filled a thermos, and left Mist with enough food to last a week. By sunset, he was on the highway, heading south, toward Grayson, toward the Crying Tree. Grayson didn't look like a town haunted by tragedy. It looked like a postcard that no one mailed. The downtown strip had a diner with actual jukeboxes in the booths, gas pumps with analog counters, old men playing checkers in front of the hardware store. Tim parked at a motel just outside town, the Pine Hollow Inn. No website, no credit card machine. Just a woman named Denise who handed him a key and warned him about deer on the highway. Room 6 smelled like damp wood and cigarette ghosts. Tim dropped his bag and opened the window. The trees were closer than they looked on the map. He didn't go into the woods that first night. Instead, he drove into town and ate greasy hash at the diner. He asked casual questions. Any recent accidents, strange noises, weird tourist stories? Most people just shrugged. But one waitress, maybe in her 40s, paused when he mentioned the woods north of Grayson. You don't want to camp out there, she said, topping off his coffee. Wind messes with your head. Wind? It sounds like someone crying. You think it's close, but it's never close. Just circling. She didn't say more. Tim didn't push. That night, he sat outside his room with a notebook and an old-fashioned recorder. He documented everything he'd learned so far. Ryan Mercer had vanished after the incident. His blog hinted at fear, not guilt. There were no official follow-ups, no forensic evidence, just 3 missing kids and 1 scared boy who heard a tree cry. At midnight, Tim heard it. Not crying exactly, not wind, something in between. It came from the trees. He didn't sleep. In the morning, he packed a flashlight, a trail map, a compass, and headed for the coordinates. Time to find the Crying Tree. The path off Route 12 wasn't marked. It barely qualified as a trail, just a break in the underbrush, narrow and clawed with briars. The forest here didn't feel untouched. It felt ignored. Like the kind of place nature reclaimed not with violence, but with slow, deliberate forgetting. The air changed the deeper he went. Colder, though the sun hadn't disappeared. Quieter, though he could still hear the wind if he listened hard enough. But the birds had gone silent. That bothered him more. Tim checked the GPS. He was close. He stepped through a curtain of moss and saw it. A clearing. Dead quiet. Sunlight pooled like syrup through the canopy. And there it was. The tree. It wasn't massive, not ancient, but it stood alone. Every other tree gave it space, maybe 20 feet on all sides. Its bark was darker than the rest, worn smooth in strange patches like it had been touched too often. Scratched into the base were initials. Dozens, maybe more. Names. He stepped closer. The ground beneath his boots gave slightly. Not mud, not rot, just soft. He knelt, ran a hand over the base. The tree was weeping. A thin line of clear sap ran from a gash near its center. It wasn't sticky, it was cold. He turned on the recorder. "This is Tim Evans, Grayson, North Carolina, approximately half a mile north of Route 12. I've located the tree described in the Ryan Mercer case. It appears to be leaking sap from a fresh wound." The wind shifted. He heard it again, a sound low and distant, not crying, a name. His name, Tim. He turned fast. No one there. The forest held its breath. He clicked off the recorder. He needed to find Ryan, because something out here knew his name. Back in Grayson, the daylight felt thinner. Tim sat in his car in front of a laundromat that hadn't changed since the 80s. He scrolled through old records, zoning maps, and utility bills until he found a lid. One property under the name Mercer, owned by a Margaret Mercer, listed as Ryan's guardian in a school emergency contact file. She still lived there. Tim drove past the address first, just to see it. A small white house on the edge of a field. No mailbox. Curtains drawn. A rusting van in the driveway. A fence, low and half collapsed, did nothing to keep the world out. He parked 2 houses down and walked the rest. The knock sounded louder than it should have in the still air. It took a while before the door opened. The woman who answered looked like she hadn't been sleeping well for a decade. Her face tightened when she saw him. Not fear. Not surprise. Recognition. "You're not a reporter," she said. "No." "But you're here about the woods." Tim nodded. "Ryan doesn't talk to people. I'm not here to make him talk," Tim said. "I just want to listen." She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. The house smelled of cedar and reheated coffee. A TV murmured softly in the background, some rerun no one was watching. Ryan was in the back room, sitting in a chair by the window, staring out at the field. He didn't look up when Tim entered. "Hey," Tim said, keeping his voice level. Ryan nodded slightly. Still didn't look away from the window. Tim didn't press. He sat down across from him, left a respectful distance, pulled the recorder from his coat pocket and set it on the floor. "I found it," he said. "The tree." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I heard it," Tim continued. "It said my name." Ryan finally turned. That's how it starts," he said, voice thin but steady. "It remembers names, but not yours, the ones you carry." Tim frowned. "The ones I? You'll see." Ryan went quiet again. Tim waited a full minute before asking, "Did it stop for you after you left?" Ryan shook his head. "You don't leave. It just gets quiet until someone else listens." He turned back to the window. Tim looked out too. The tree line was just visible in the distance. Still. Patient. He wasn't done with it. Not even close. The next morning, Tim woke before the sun. The woods waited. He packed light. Camera, notebook, thermos, knife, flashlight, batteries, compass. No gun. He didn't believe in shooting things he didn't understand. He left a note at the motel front desk. "If I'm not back by tomorrow, call this number." He scribbled Ronald's contact. He doubted it would matter. By 6 a.m., the trail swallowed him again. Everything looked different. It wasn't just the light. The path he'd taken 2 days earlier was narrower, the trees denser, as if the forest was trying to heal over his intrusion. Birdsong returned briefly, then faded again the deeper he went. When he reached the clearing, the air was still, heavy, like a room after a long argument. The crying tree stood unchanged, but it felt fuller, like it had grown overnight, though nothing physical was different. Tim circled it. He didn't approach immediately. This time he listened. The wind moved, curling between trunks like breath through teeth. A whisper. Names. Nathers. He pulled out the recorder. "This is Tim Evans." Second visit to the crying tree. Audible phenomena present. Multiple names. Can't make them all out. Same tone as before, like breath. Or sorrow. Then it stopped. Not gradually. All at once. Tim turned. Someone stood at the edge of the clearing. Small. Pale. Still. A child. Barefoot. Clothes too clean. Head tilted slightly. Tim didn't move. He blinked once, and the figure was gone. He didn't chase. He didn't have to, because now he could hear the tree again. And this time, it wasn't whispering. It was sobbing. He stayed in the clearing until dusk. Didn't move. Didn't speak. Just listened. The tree never stopped crying. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't ignorable either. The sound moved, like it came from inside the wood, from the roots and not the branches. It had rhythm. Almost like breath between sobs. By the time Tim finally stood, his legs were stiff and his throat dry. Back at the motel, he played the recording. There was nothing, just wind. No names, no crying, no footsteps. He rewound and listened again, slower. Still nothing. Then just before the end of the tape, a whisper. Stay. The next morning, Ryan was waiting outside Tim's motel room. He sat on the curb, hoodie up, hands buried in the sleeves. Tim opened the door and waited. Ryan didn't move. I saw one, Tim said finally. Ryan nodded. They don't come to everyone. You said it remembers names. It remembers grief. Ryan looked up, eyes sunken but sharp. The ones who didn't come back, they weren't just lost. The tree doesn't take the ones who are happy. Tim frowned. It selects people? Ryan nodded. It calls to something you forgot how to carry. They sat in silence. Then Ryan said, I buried something out there. Tim waited. My brother, Ryan whispered. Not his body, just something of his. The day before it happened, he pulled something from his pocket. A keychain. Cheap plastic. A baseball bat. The kind you'd win at an arcade. I think I need to dig it up. Tim nodded slowly. I'll go with you, he said. They left before noon. Together. The forest didn't welcome them back. It watched. The trail twisted differently now, as if the landscape shifted its bones while no one was looking. Tim and Ryan said little. The only sound was the brush of boots on damp earth and the occasional snap of a hidden twig. When they reached the clearing, Ryan stopped short. He stared at the tree like it had grown teeth. I haven't been here since it happened, he said. Tim glanced at him. You sure you want to do this? No, but it's time. Ryan stepped into the open and knelt near the base of the tree. He pressed his palm into the soil, feeling for the spot. Tim stood back, watching the tree. It wept. Ryan began to dig with his hands. The earth gave easily, too easily, like it remembered being disturbed. Minutes passed. Then, a dull thud. Ryan pulled out a metal tin, rusted and warped. He opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was the keychain and a photo. 2 boys, standing on a baseball field, grinning like idiots. One of them was Ryan. The other, smaller, holding a mitt, was his brother. Ryan's breath hitched. The tree groaned. Tim stepped forward. What do we do with it? Ryan didn't answer. He stood, faced the tree, and placed the tin at its base. I remember you, he said. I miss you. The tree stopped crying. The silence hit like pressure in the chest. Then a single breath of wind, not cold, not sharp, just relief. Ryan turned to Tim. I think we're done. But even as they walked away, he didn't look back, and he knew the tree wasn't done with him. That night, Ryan sat across from Tim at the motel's tiny desk, hands wrapped around a mug of tea he didn't drink. I never told anyone what happened during those 2 days, he said. Not even my aunt. Tim nodded slowly. I'm listening. Ryan stared past him into the wood-paneled wall, like it might remember better than he could. We weren't just lost. We followed something. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. It looked like us sometimes, but wrong. It led us deeper and deeper, and we didn't think to question it, like it made us forget how. He took a breath. My brother followed it first, then the others. They weren't afraid, just pulled. I stayed behind because I fell, twisted my ankle, sat by a creek for hours, thought they'd come back. He looked at Tim. When night came, I heard the tree cry. It sounded like them. All of them, over and over. And when I walked back, I couldn't find them, just the tree. He placed the photo between them, the 2 boys smiling. It remembers what we leave behind. It feeds on what we try to forget. The kids never screamed, never fought. They just went with it, like it promised something better. Tim was quiet for a long time. Why you? He asked. Why did it let you go? Ryan looked down. I didn't want to forget. The next day, Tim made a call. Lenora picked up after 4 rings. I hoped I wouldn't hear from you again, she said, which means you need something. There's something in the woods. Ryan saw it. It looked like people he trusted, but wrong. It led the kids away. Lenora didn't speak for a long moment. They're called Hollowlings, she said finally. Forest-bred, opportunistic. They follow old grief, mimic the living, and feed on the moments someone chooses to follow. They take the shape of lost loved ones, or what we think we want to see. Once the victim steps into their reach, they're removed, swallowed, sometimes literally. Can they be stopped? Yes, she said, but not easily. You'll need to mark them, force them to reveal their true form. Fire weakens them. Naming them traps them, and you must anchor their feeding ground or they'll regrow somewhere nearby. Tim looked at the sketch he'd made of the clearing. The tree. Yes, it anchors them. A natural conduit. So I destroy it? No, Lenora said firmly. You don't destroy anchors, you replace them. That night, Tim and Ryan returned to the tree one last time. They brought shovels, salt, stones, and a box filled with photos, things the missing kids had left behind, gathered from yearbooks and old social pages. Memories reclaimed. They dug a circle around the tree. Tim scattered ash from burned yew across the perimeter, something Lenora insisted on. Ryan pressed iron nails into the base, each wrapped in twine. When the final one was placed, Tim stepped back and began reading the invocation. Words that scraped the throat raw, old syllables meant to force masks off monsters. The air thickened, the tree pulsed, and then it screamed. A shape peeled off from its trunk, child-sized, wrong-faced, eyes hollow. Ryan didn't flinch. He held up the keychain. This is his. You don't get to wear him anymore. The thing lunged, then hit the salt line and burst into a flash of smoke and bark. Ryan whispered his brother's name. Once. Then again. When it was done, the air changed. The tree wept again, but it was softer now, like grief instead of hunger. Tim left Grayson the next morning. No more whispers, no more names. But as he drove, he saw something in the woods through the passenger window. A small figure, standing still, watching. Then it was gone. He didn't stop, he just drove, until the tree was far behind him, but